Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on our RSA Conference Full Pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th to May 9th in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, please visit securityweekly.com/RSAC24 and use the code 54U SecWeekly. That's 54U SecWeekly. We hope to see you there. All right. And topic for this interview is threat modeling and understanding inherent threats. We're excited to have Adam Shostack from Shostack and Associates with us today. Adam is the author of Threat Modeling, Designing for Security and Threats, What Every Engineer Should Learn from Star Wars. He's a leading expert on threat modeling, a consultant, expert witness, and game designer. His experience ranges across the business world from founding startups to nearly a decade at Microsoft. And fun fact, Adam helped create the CVE, that CVE. And a bunch of other stuff. You've kept really busy over the years, Adam. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, and so threat modeling is kind of your thing. You know, that's a big part of everything that you do, and I think that's where we should start. So for folks who have and this is something I've kind of noticed in the industry in general. Like, you can throw out terms like, I'm sure everybody's heard threat modeling, but I'm sure there's a Venn diagram between people who have heard the term and actually understands what it is when people say it. Because nobody wants to feel dumb. Nobody wants to raise their hand and say, what does that mean? So let's lay some foundation here and maybe give people the elevator pitch on threat modeling and why it's useful for security.
Sure. So I think of threat modeling as the measure twice, cut once of security. And if we're building something physical, we measure twice so that we don't have to redo our work. And we do the same thing as we're working in cybersecurity. We think about what we're going to do, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, before we start committing code, before we start ordering firewalls or rolling out VPCs. And that work to anticipate what can go wrong helps us prepare. And we can do this in software, we can do this in operations, we can do this in SRE and DevOps. And for me, threat modeling is a collection of activities where we answer those questions of what are we working on, what can go wrong. And the ways we do that, people might have seen data flow diagrams. People sometimes call those threat modeling diagrams because they're so associated with threat modeling. They might have heard of Stride and use it to threat model. But I think the key things that I want everybody to know: first, it's the measure twice, cut once. Second, it applies to almost everything we do. And third, you don't have to get fancy. You don't have to get super deep into, do I want to use Stride, or do I want to use this methodology or that methodology? If you simply start by asking what can go wrong, we start to get good answers, and then we can go deeper on them.
Yeah, and I imagine there's kind of equal parts of, understanding the system itself, so kind of two sides here, like understanding your system. One of my No offense to your book, but one of my favorite books for threat modeling is the threat modeling chapter in the car hacker's handbook, because a car has a very interesting threat model. Yeah,
Okay.
and I think a lot of people understand, like, it's easy to relate to a car, I guess easier than maybe a database for most people.
Yeah, so I haven't read it. I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, it's actually, you can grab a handbook. It's one of those books that, like, they released it for free. You can buy a physical copy, but you can
Oh,
just go search the Car Hacker's Handbook and it'll hand you a PDF. Not a and it was intentionally released for free. You know, that's not like a stolen PDF that somebody put together. But yeah, so I imagine, there's a two sides. You have to understand the system itself, and then you have to understand the threats to it. So kind of like, do you break it up like that? Like, here's the internal component and the external component for threat modeling.
say more about what you mean, because I thought your question was going somewhere else. What do you mean by
Oh,
the
okay.
internal component, external component?
Yeah, well, so, your threat, well, presumably people are going to be threat modeling for something that they own, something that they own and operate or build themselves. Um, uh, so understanding that, that's kind of the internal piece, like you have control over that,
Okay.
right? And then the piece you don't have control over are the threats and the attacks against that thing, right? And that's a very different body of knowledge that you have to understand.
And I want to point out that this goes back to the first thing you said, which is people are embarrassed to ask, what does that mean?
Right.
Um, Sort of a superpower, being willing to embarrass yourself. So
Essential in some job roles. Like, I had to learn that as an industry analyst because people would just be throwing out terms. I'm like, I remember the first time I heard POV, they kept using this term POV. And back then to
point of
me,
view, right?
right, right. I'm like, point of view does not fit in how they're using this acronym. And so eventually I asked, and they were like, "Oh,
Proof of value.
proof of value,
Yeah,
right?" And I was like, "Proof of value? What's that?" They were like, "Oh, it's like proof of concept." Why don't you just say proof of concept then? It's not trendy enough, I guess.
yeah, yeah. So to go to the question you asked,
Yeah.
the
So
that intersection. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go ahead?
yeah, yeah. If you wanted me to, I thought you wanted me to restate the problem, but if you still got it, go ahead.
I got it. I got it. It's a great question. One of the things. So let me answer it and then comment on it. Developers, operations people often know what they're going to build. And then security people will come in as consultants. And we do a bunch of work where the developer explains, I'm building something like this, or the ops person says, I'm rolling out these VPCs and I'm going to use Lambdas and S3s. And then the security person does some analysis. And that history of how we did that, of how we bring people together, it has a lot of power. And it also ends up being hard to scale because getting those security people into the room, teaching them about the applications, turns out to be hard. And so, a lot of where I am these days is I work with organizations to help them develop threat modeling processes is let's train your normal engineers to do this work. Let's give them frameworks so that they can get a basic understanding of threats. And then the work that we need consultants to do, the work that we need a central security group to help with, are where things are complicated, where there's intricate trade offs, because and I don't mean this in a critical way, but in an acknowledgement way. Most security problems, once you see them, are not that complicated. It was a
Mhm.
matter of getting the skilled eyes to look in the right place. And so, if we can provide the people who are building these things with a little bit of knowledge, with a little bit of, oh, I should look for unmanaged strings being concatenated together.
Mhm.
Once we started talking about that as a problem, it started to disappear and there was a lot of legacy. Once we started talking about SQL injection, we got better frameworks that make it harder to write SQL injection. We got developers saying, hey, wait a minute, we should be doing something other than building query strings randomly. And so a lot of my work is about how do we take the stuff that you and I and your listeners know and make it accessible and useful to the folks around them.
I imagine there's a lot of like forehead slapping, a lot of stuff that's obvious, but not until you point it out. So a lot of it, I imagine, is making sure that they can see things from that perspective. From the oftentimes it's what I think of as abuse cases. I think of, okay, beautiful thing you've built here. Now think about, put yourself in these kinds of shoes and do terrible things with it. Right. Like it's a really old example, but the Domino's mobile app, people using it to prank folks and send hundreds of pizzas because there was no
Okay.
threshold on the number of pizzas you could order with it. And there was no validation that this was that this person was willing to pay for it. So not only would 100 pizzas show up, but there'd be a handout waiting for payment. That was something they had to pivot very quickly on. Okay, you're going to have to pay in advance, and there's
Mm,
going to be an upper bound, like above this number of pizzas you got to call us and talk to us.
yeah, I mean, one of the books that I enjoyed, although it was tough to get into, was on domain-driven design. And instead of having an int for the number of pizzas that you order, you define a variable number of pizzas and you put some business rules on it because I'm pretty sure that the max pizza is smaller than max int.
Right. Yes. Very, very much so.
And the abuse case thing is a great way for people to get started. And I've also seen that it's really hard for some folks. They're like, I don't know. I'm not a criminal.
Right. But
Um,
you
and
sometimes have to think like one.
y- so this is really for me a matter of usability studies, right? How do we teach people what are the effective methods to get them through this hump? And it's it's not the things that bring us into security, right? So you and I thinking like an attacker is great, but you and I don't know how to think like a Domino's pizza owner,
Right.
right? I mean, I don't even know what challenges their franchisees face on a daily basis. I assume it's like supply chain and keep getting my teenagers to wash their hands before they make the pizzas.
I was once a manager of a Papa John's, so you
Oh,
presume much here. I maybe I understand more of it than you think.
I, you absolutely will understand more of it than I do. Um, and and so I'm just curious, what are the big problems that you faced as a manager of a Papa John's?
Well, I mean, a lot of it's logistics, so like with any restaurant, it's food costs also, so Papa John's, for example, to use that example, the one that I understand, we have a commissary service. So the dough gets made somewhere in a dough factory somewhere, and like the dough has to proof and rise before you can use it. So a very delicate ecosystem. Like if you miss one of these commissary deliveries, they can't make it to you. You might either run out of dough, or if it finally makes it and you are completely out, now you have underproof dough that you can't really use yet. It's really hard. It hasn't softened enough. And then there's all kinds of wacky things with drivers, all kinds of abuse cases there. Like, what happens if your driver just doesn't come back? Like, you've got or they big issue with drivers in the pizza business is having other businesses that require them to drive around from place to place, and them trying to like double dip and do two jobs at once. I won't go, some people will know exactly what I'm talking about, but won't go too deep there. Maybe the other business isn't a legal one, but yeah, there's a lot of things there that you have to. There's a lot of threat modeling that goes on, and almost all of it has to do with logistics, right? Because you're
Okay.
taking orders. The expectation is, and since we started with Domino's, I think they were the ones that had the, pizza there in so many minutes or it's free thing. So there's and a lot of people tried to abuse that, right? Like they would try and how can we slow this driver down to to make sure we always get our pizza for free, right?
How can we pick the Domino's that is just at the end of the delivery boundary so that the driver has as far to drive as possible?
Or my buddy's a state trooper, like pull him over,
Wow.
right? Small town stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, like what we're doing right now, I imagine you probably do a lot of this, a lot of analogies, a lot of examples and things like that probably really help send the stuff home.
So our focus is we teach people about STRIDE. STRIDE's a mnemonic for those who don't know. It stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and expansion of authority. I say that a lot. um, and
I
you
see
can
why you call it stride.
you can use this to find threats, and we also teach people about kill chains, right? There's going to be some
Mhm.
reconnaissance, there's going to be initial access, there's going to be some actions on objectives. And if you break it down for people and make it specific in the same way that you're talking about the dough has to proof, it has to rise before it's pliable and usable, you give people those steps and you can get to a reproducible process that delivers pizzas. Where if you tell them, hey, make sure the dough is ready, they'll be like, what do I do exactly? And so some of it's reasoning by analogy, some of it's drawing on life experience, and some of it is how do we give people these tools that get them somewhere they need to go so that we're not having the problems that when someone sees them, it's like, oh, that again.
Mhm.
And honestly, this piece, there's a thing in education called the curse of expertise, where professors who are people with substantial depth of knowledge in their fields, right? They move the fields forward. They've forgotten what it was like
Mhm.
to not know these things. And in fact, my Star Wars book is really my mea culpa for that, which is I just assumed for a while that everyone understands what spoofing is.
Right.
Uh, Turns out they don't. Um, and also repudiation is a big one, and a lot of these pizza problems are repudiation problems. No, it was 29 minutes, not 31 minutes, sir. um,
Yeah.
and so giving people this knowledge and finding ways to make it usable and accessible is a really big thing for me. And since we were mentioning it at the start, I've got a new free white paper. And when I say
Mhm.
free, not even a reg wall. You go to showstack.org/white papers, and there's a paper on inherent threats. And the idea is some threats are accidental, right? We had SQL injection. We'll rewrite this into a prepared statement and we're done. Other threats are inherent. If you have a pizza delivery app, there's a threat the pizza will show up with the cheese on the top of the box. Um, And you can try to get your drivers to slow down, and you can
Mhm.
try, you could, there may be stuff you can do about it, but it's going to happen some fraction of the time. And what we found as we were training was that people got really confused, right? Over here, I've got an answer to what can go wrong that takes me 30 seconds. And over here, I've got one that I have to spend my life dealing with it. But
Mhm.
they're all answers to what can go wrong. Why are my answers to what are we going to do about it so different? And so
Right.
we've got these accidents, we've got these inherent ones, and we've got these trade offs. And trade
Yeah.
offs are places like usability, right? The better we
Mhm.
authenticate people, the less usable it generally is, right? You have to get a code, you have to enter the code, you have to be doing it from the machine with the pass keys on it, whatever it is, we have to deal with the human in that loop. And so, well, in a sense, this is sort of obvious. It actually really lifts some scales from people. It makes them more able to do their job.
Right. Right. Yeah, and just talking about, inherent threats, like it's, it occurs to me that, some problems you can fix. You can like it's a configuration change, or it's maybe it is something that introduces more friction, but you deem it to be accessible, like using a security key or a push notification on your phone. But some of them, like if you get into, and the only example coming to mind right away is fraud. Shrink in the retail industry. Like some of these, you can only minimize the chances. It's not a binary, whoops, we forgot to flip that switch type of situation. It's more of a, best effort to prevent.
It's a best effort. It's what's acceptable to the business. And, both of us wrote pieces on the recent cyber safety review board
Mhm.
report about Microsoft. And at some level, that report is about Microsoft didn't manage the cryptographic keys that are used to authenticate people. And one of those keys was stolen and then used in an attack. And if you're going to have cryptographic keys, there is a risk that they can be stolen, right? We can put them into hardware security modules. We can
Mhm.
use different keys for different customers. There's a list actually in this great report by the Cyber Safety Review Board of things that large scale cloud providers are doing today to protect these keys, all of which mitigate the risk. Let me take the word risk out. They reduce the likelihood that something will happen. They constrain the damage if it does. And so if we think of risk as probability times impact, we're shrinking that risk, but it's still present, and we still need detection
Mhm.
mechanisms. We still need response mechanisms to catch those sorts of things as they're happening.
Yeah, it's a really good example too, because that's one of those inherent threats, right? That you have to have these keys, but how do you minimize abuse of them? And, it reminds me of going to AWS reInvent when I was an industry analyst. I'd have a chance to chat with Stephen Schmidt, who was the CISO of AWS for a while. I think he now runs AWS since Jassy went up to the CEO of Amazon level. And every it was back in a time when I was still getting used to the big changes between waterfall agile, on-prem and cloud, and learning this world. So we're talking like 2013, 2014. And it was fascinating to me that the security team's goals every year was to reduce their access to customer workloads and data by a certain percentage. Like they're always trying to reduce their access to reduce that risk that any of their identities could be stolen and
Mhm.
abused, and used to access customer data. So they're constantly trying to increase friction, to access this stuff. That like for them, the trade-off they were willing to go to would be extreme for anyone else, but they're AWS, they're already then they were an enormous cloud provider. And they foresaw, yeah, we're going to be a target. We're going to have a big target painted on our backs. So we need to make it, we need to be comfortable with it being much more difficult to access this data and to use keys like that, for example.
One of the things that I think is really interesting, and I don't think I really, really understood this until a couple of years ago, because there's the bumper sticker. The cloud is just someone else's computer.
But yeah, yeah,
But the cloud providers really, if you think about what an operating system does, an operating system is privileged software that mediates access to hardware.
right.
And at cloud scale, it's yes, they'll sell you an instance and one computer, right? They'll let you run your VMs because it's understandable. But when you start moving to Lambdas and
Mhm.
S3s and application
Serverless.
gateways,
Yeah.
serverless, but also cloud oriented abstractions above the hardware, you get to these very different ways of building apps in the same way that building on a mobile platform is different than building on Windows or Linux. And many of the traditional things that happened, right? You pop your machine, you get local access, and you're running in a
Mhm.
shell on the Linux box. Those things are not only impossible, but they don't even make any sense in the cloud world, because the layers of abstraction do in fact have Linux boxes sitting underneath all of it,
Right.
but they're tied down. I was talking to someone about this. It might have been a conversation with you actually, about Zen and Amazon having turned off the virtual
Yep.
floppy
Yeah, that was
drive.
me.
That was you. You want to just tell this story?
Yeah. So, one of the things Amazon does when they adopt open source is they do a review of it. And part of that, is threat modeling, understand the attack surface, and even without understanding the attack surface, they just kind of pull out everything they don't need. This is why the big cloud providers make their own hardware. They don't want a Cisco router with 4,000 features. They want the dumbest, fewest lines of code, because that translates to higher reliability, less things to go wrong, less things to troubleshoot. They want only the features that they need in it. And it makes it a lot cheaper too, even if they have to build themselves. But it makes sense at scale. And so what they did when they adopted Zen is they pulled out all the legacy stuff that they didn't need. And then comes this vulnerability called Venom. This vulnerability in the Zen hypervisor, and Amazon's not the only one using it. Tons of other public cloud providers are using it, and everybody but Amazon had to reboot all their customer instances to upgrade Zen, to patch it to the version that was not vulnerable. And the reason they didn't have to patch it is the Venom vulnerability was in the virtual floppy controller code. And when they adopted it, they said, "What do we need floppy drives for in the cloud? No, get this out of here." And they just deleted that whole chunk of code.
And
It's a fun story.
one of the things I love about this story is, if I'm working for, say, a bank or a hospital system, we don't have the staffing levels to go and do those reviews for everything that we're buying and deploying.
Yeah.
But I can leverage it with a cloud provider. And that really enables this new model of, oh, the threats really do shift as you move into the cloud instead of forklifting into the cloud, right? It's a
Mhm.
different way of thinking about what you're working on. It's a different way of thinking about what can go wrong, but they've built so many layers of, oh, this problem which plagued us for years just doesn't happen anymore. And I remember I got into a discussion with someone over at Facebook about their OS query tool.
Mhm.
And I was saying something like, it would be great if you could just run a bash script here to do some queries. It would decrease the cost of writing code to go into OS query. And he looked at me and he said, we don't have bash on our machines. Why would we?
Wow. Oh my goodness.
And it's like, okay, and you just broke a huge amount of attack code
Yeah.
that eventually is looking for a shell.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no shell. There's no shell to steal. Yeah, and you were, alluding to it earlier, talking about, once you go serverless and things like that, like, there's whole classes of attacks that don't work if you realize your workload can be immutable. Okay, so, we seal the thing up, we throw it into production. There is no SSH listener. There is no SSH server listening. There is no way to log into production. Like, you still have telemetry coming out of the thing, so you can monitor what it's doing. But because it can just be destroyed and replaced, there's no need to do any kind of in place maintenance. So all of a sudden, huge amount of attack surface just disappears. And the same thing for the idea of ephemeral workloads.
Mhm.
The idea that the quicker I replace my workloads, the more reliable. Less chance I'm going to get hit with memory um, leakage issues, or there are all kinds of sloppy development things you don't have to fix if you just replace your workload on a regular basis. And don't let the log files fill up, don't let memory get filled up. But also, how do you, as an attacker, how do you retain access? How do you have long lived access to something if it's not long lived? If none of your workloads last longer than a week or a day. I've heard people who rotate credentials hourly because it's all automated. So why not?
One of the if I bring sort of a traditional operating systems perspective of processes are short-lived, but the operating system is long-lived, what we're doing is we're treating that entire operating system server instantiation as if it's a process running in this cloud operating system. And we just spin up and spin down entire machines the way we used to spin up and down processes.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
one of
Infrastructure
the
as code.
thing sorry, go ahead.
Infrastructure as code, for
Yep,
example.
infrastructure as
Yeah.
code. One of the things that I find so interesting is the difference in the way people who have really embraced this and the people for whom moving to cloud is we're going to forklift a server that we built in 2012 that we've patched a gazillion times since then, or maybe 12 times since then.
Hmm.
But it was hand built in ways that we cannot deconstruct. And there was another incident report, the one from the British Library, that said
Hmm.
that many of their processes were running on software that's no longer for sale. And so when they tried to rebuild after a ransomware incident, they literally couldn't buy the software they needed to bring it back up. And they pointed out that that investment, that tech debt, which all came due at the same time, turned out to be really, really expensive.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, it sounded like you were gonna say something
No,
after that.
I was maybe going to say something, but
Yeah.
really, it's this lesson learning attitude that is so valuable, and that I love that the British Library released this report, which was just,
This
hey,
is news to me, I'm downloading it right now.
you're downloading.
That's why I'm distracted.
I've got a blog post about it as well, because I really think that one of the big opportunities that we as an industry have to get better faster is talking more about the problems we've experienced.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
you know, the idea that we can't talk about this stuff, it, it turns out to be self-imposed.
Mhm.
The people who do talk about it, right? Mandiant, for example, the reason we know about solar winds
Right.
was Mandiant said, "Hey, we had a near miss, and holy cow, look what we found."
Yeah. Same with Okta and, 1Password, Cloudflare, and BeyondTrust, were the 3 that, detailed their experiences with that attack, and
Okay.
it took a while for them to convince Okta that, "Hey, like, something's going on. You guys need to check this out," and super valuable when they share, those lessons.
Oh, that's right. Okta was the one where the thing
The
that
support.
Okta was telling you to do included uploading credentials, but they didn't really mention that problem.
So this is a tricky one, and this goes to your trade-off stuff. So this is you know, worth taking a couple minutes to dive into. So so HAR files. What a HAR file is, you can go into the developer tools in Chrome, and you can tell it to record everything that happens. Great for troubleshooting, but will capture credentials. And the extension that it saves it as is HAR. So that's why we're calling it HAR files. And so the support folks at Okta will ask you to record a HAR file, of you experiencing this bug that you want them to fix, and upload it, so they can analyze that HAR file, figure out what's going on, and hopefully code together a fix. Now, Okta does have a warning on their website. It says make sure you scrub any credentials out of this HAR file before you upload it. And so I said, okay, and I role played as a customer of Okta. I saved a HAR file. And without being the developer of the website that I was testing this on, I had no idea where the OAuth key was. I couldn't tell just by looking at this HAR file. I don't know how to scrub this thing. And all the tools that were released, Cloudflare put together a tool and released it to scrub your HAR files. All those tools still depend on you knowing the variable name that you want to delete from this file, or the actual cookie object, which never have, or in my testing at least, never seem to have any useful variable names like credential or OAuth key or anything like that. It's like some random string of letters that gets assigned to this thing. And so it turns out scrubbing a HAR file is really hard. So of course everyone ignored that advice and just uploaded it without doing that, because it turns out that's a hard thing to do. It's not simple. It's not enough. And that was one of my opinions about this, is it's not enough for Okta to say, hey, scrub these things. Like, I think they're responsible for also on their side making sure nobody's giving them credentials into these environments.
Or maybe Chrome should not be recording credentials
That's
as
another place you could fix it. Yeah.
unless you check the box that says make this a dangerous HAR file,
Yeah.
or
But
put the
again,
creds in.
Chrome doesn't know which variable's what. Like, Chrome doesn't have any way of identifying that this variable is a credential and this one's not.
Doesn't it though? I mean, not perfectly, but
No,
there are
they're all just variables.
is
To
aren't
Chrome,
they
like when you
isn't the OAuth token something that Chrome handles for you like a JWT?
nope, nope. No,
Oh,
there's no standardization. It is literally just a variable.
oh,
And it is just an entry in a cookie file. Like that entry could be your birth date or it could be a credential, but it's all the same to Chrome.
wow. Wow. Exciting. If only they had
All it
threat
is a
modeled.
data entry. Yeah.
If only they had built some standard libraries to help you do the standard authentication pieces that every
Well,
website needs to do.
and you can, right? Like you can log in using Google. Like that's their answer is just, log in using Google
Okay.
instead, and yeah. And instead it's going to use the browser's going to authenticate that. It doesn't need to save anything. It just goes and checks your logged in session. So there's no credential for that application to save in a cookie.
Okay. Huh.
So yeah, that's where so it also ends up being a bit of a pitch, right? Like, getting everybody to use Google for SSO. So it's like, yeah, we got a solution for your problem. It benefits us, but it is a solution for your problem.
Yeah, there's a whole can of worms right there.
Yeah. But yeah, I love talking about trade-offs too, because in this paper, you have this spectrum, and I've never seen it put this way before, and I find it a really useful, uh, you know, way of looking at it, where you have accidental, trade-off, and then inherent. Talking about the spectrum of threats. And I think that's it's been really helpful in just having this conversation with you today.
Well, thank you. And let me just mention in that little graph, the vertical axis is protect, detect, and respond. And as you move from accidental to inherent, the amount of detecting, the amount of responding that you're going to do goes up. And so, for example, with this HAR file issue, today, I would hope that Okta gives you some advice, right? And maybe this is a complex tool to build,
Mhm.
but it's pretty clear from what happened with Okta that it's also an important thing for people to be building. It's an important thing for people to be aware of when they're debugging or touching these HAR
Yeah.
files.
Yeah, and that was the bulk of my my writing about that incident was we need to understand how to sanitize the HAR files. That's clearly an unsolved problem. It's a very common problem. We've got to use them to troubleshoot. But I don't see an easy way to do this, and I don't see anybody stepping up to solve it. So if any listeners, I'm not a web developer, so you will certainly not in recent years. But yeah, my PHP experience is probably not useful here. But but yeah, if anybody, if there are simpler fixes for these, I'd love to hear about them, or if there are obvious solutions to some of these problems. But it seems like very much an unsolved problem from everything I've seen.
Indeed. Indeed.
Right. So that's about the time we have left. But I understand. Speaking of analogies, your book, relies on Star Wars for some help there, and I understand Star Wars Day is coming up.
If you're looking for a gift for the geek in your life, um, people have enjoyed the book. It's out there, and give it a shot.
What's the name of the book again?
It is Threats: What Every Engineer Should Learn from Star Wars.
Very, very good. Very nice. Thank you so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today, Adam.
Thank you.
All right. And a big thanks to everyone watching or listening to this week's episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. We will see you next week. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we'll see you next week.